Welcome everyone. Thanks for checking out our new series, Shelter in Peace, as we journey through 4 weeks on the character of God. My name is Cody and I'm going to be guiding us through this journey. So I want to give, before we start, just a quick overview as to where this series is going in each of the videos. So this whole idea really came out of this COVID-19 season while going through a couple of Psalms. And one of the Psalms and the verses really struck me and really birthed this series. And it's kind of our theme verse for this. It's Psalm 142 verses 4 and 5. And it says this: "Look to the right and see, no one stands up for me. There is no refuge for me, no one cares about me. I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my shelter, my portion in the land of the living." It's this idea that the Lord is our shelter, right? But sometimes it's hard to take shelter in something or someone that you do not know, right? And that's why we're going to be working through the character of God. Now, we have a kind of a theme statement for this series. And each week, each of the videos, we're going to be able to fill in the blank for that statement. And the statement is this: because God is, I can trust him. Right? And I made this something easy for anyone really to be able to memorize. But not just that. If you're a parent with kids at home and your kids are a little older, this is something that you can teach them so that they can memorize as well. So each of these episodes is going to be really the teaching portion for one of our community groups. So there is going to be this teaching portion right after this. And then I'm going to bring in a fun special guest, Miss Vicky. She's going to talk to you parents with kids as to how you can take some of these truths and communicate it to your kids in this season. Lastly, if you look in the description of the video below, you're going to see a link to a Google Doc. That Google Doc is going to have all the points for this first video, as well as some discussion questions that we're going to use in our community group as a way to go deeper into this topic and just provoke some more ideas. So, with all that being said, let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to our second episode in the Shelter in Peace series. My name is Cody, and let me give us a quick recap of what we covered in our last lesson so that when we can move on in this. Our last lesson, we took a look at God's sovereignty, and our theme statement for that was, because God is sovereign, I can trust him. Today we're going to be looking at another characteristic of God, which is that God is wise. So if you have Bibles, I would encourage you to open to Romans chapter 11. We're going to be looking in verses 33 through 36 on God's wisdom. Paul writes this in those verses. He says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and of the knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and untraceable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? And who has ever given to God that he should be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." So in looking at the wisdom of God here in this passage, right, the first thing we see is that God possesses all knowledge and wisdom. Right? We see that in the first half of verse 33 where Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and of the knowledge of God." Now, there is a difference here in the words that are used for wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge here is referring to all things, that is like all facts or things that can be learned. Wisdom, however, here is really referring to the utilization of knowledge and experiences. Right? And this is probably the hardest point for us to kind of wrap our heads around, which is the wisdom portion. I think most people, when they think of God, can wrap their minds around and get behind the whole God knows all things part. Right? That is the knowledge portion. And I think we can understand that because it's something we can wrap our minds around, just that God knows all facts. Easy. But it's really hard for us to grasp the wisdom portion because it's not as tangible, right? Because facts are things that I can find in books or online. But wisdom, however, is a bit different. It's not just that God knows all things, but he knows how each thing and event and person will affect each thing and person and event in every situation for all of time, right? That's wisdom. And because either we haven't heard this before or because we don't think or dwell on it enough, that is really that when things don't go the way we think they should. This is really one of the things that we're pushing back on. Because really, when we argue that God was wrong to allow something to happen, we're leveraging an argument in part against God's wisdom. And most of the time, it would seem that we would say something like this: if God knew what this was going to do to me, or if God knew how this would affect me, he wouldn't have allowed this to happen. Right? This is, at its core, saying that if God had either more knowledge, right, if he had more information, or if he knew how that thing would affect a person, that is, if God had more wisdom, then he would have done something differently. But for us to say this, it actually brings us to our second point we see in this text. Right? We see that God has the highest vantage point at which to view events. Right? We see that in the second half of verse 33, where Paul then writes, how unsearchable are his judgments and how untraceable are his ways. Now, when I say God is the highest vantage point, I'm not talking about height. Right? In part, this is actually touching on the fact that God is eternal. For God, all of time is seen at the same time. Right? God being eternal and being above in power and in all other things, God being above all things, is the highest place at which one can view and judge events. Right? So remember this statement that actually brought us to this point. It's that if God knew X, or if God knew how this thing would affect X, then he wouldn't have allowed it to happen. But for us to make a statement like that is for us to say directly against this verse, the second half of verse 33, that not only can we search God's judgments, but that we can also trace his ways, and that we would do those things and say at times that his actions were wrong. And when we do things like this, if we're really being honest, we're not doing them from a place of power or actual knowledge. We're doing them from a place of pain. Right? Something has happened in our lives that is tragic or is not what we planned it to be. So we lash back by saying that essentially that we know better. So the third point we see here really follows from the first two. And our third point is this. It's therefore that God has no or needs no counselor or consultant. Right? We see that in verses 34 and 35. Paul writes, "For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? And who has ever given to God that he should be repaid?" So based on our first 2 points, this point must follow. If God already possesses all knowledge and wisdom, and he is at the highest vantage point at which to view all events, then this is obvious. Because who would be able to be God's counselor? Right? Because anyone who would be counseling God or advising God would be doing so based on lesser knowledge and lesser wisdom. And inherent to the idea of giving counsel or consultation is that the one giving the consultation or counsel has something the person receiving it does not. Has some sort of knowledge or information or further details that the one receiving it does not. And based on the first 2 points, who could possibly be that counselor for God? So the fourth point we see here is that God controls all things, based on his knowledge and wisdom, to end in his glory. Right, we see this in verse 36. Paul says, "For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." Now, this is our last point. This is the end to which God is orchestrating all things. That is, to his glory. And this is another area that we push back against on God's wisdom. Because not only did an event turn out the way we didn't think it should turn out, but we also think that all situations and events in our lives are for us. But here Paul says, from God and through God and to God are all things. Right? All things in this life are to be pointing to the glory of God. And that is exactly how God is orchestrating all things. Right, so the first week in this series, we learned that God is in control. Now we see that God is not just in control. God is in control and he knows what he is doing. That's why our theme statement today is, because God is wise, I can trust him. So with that being our lesson today, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Vicky, and she's going to give you a quick object lesson for you parents with kids as to how you can try to communicate this truth to your kids at home in a season such as this.
Hello parents, I'm so glad you joined us again. This week we are in week 2 of our Shelter in Peace series, and this week's focus is I can follow God because he is wise. Our object lesson for this week is friendly for all ages. All you're going to need is an old board game. That's right, we are kicking it back with a game night, but with a twist. I would highly recommend a game most of your kids might not recognize. You're going to open it up and let them have the chance to explore the contents of the game without showing or allowing them to read the directions. Once they unpack the game, let them tell you how they think the game should be played. I'm sure your kids are going to have some very interesting and creative ways to play the game, so enjoy. Once the excitement all dies down, I would encourage you to read through 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 through 15, and James chapter 1, verse 5. Feel free to explain to your kids that some things in life don't really require directions, like putting together some new appliances can be self-explanatory and don't require instructions. But when it comes to a new board game, it's a little different. Each game has different pieces, tokens, characters, spinners, and some even require dice or cards. The best place to start if you're trying to learn a new game is by reading the directions. It tells you step by step how to set up the game, how to start the game, how to play the game, and how the game will end. Each game is full of strategy and choices. So is life. When life presents you with a tough choice or puts you in a situation that you're not quite sure how to handle, it's good to know where we can go for instruction and guidance. See, God our Creator is the source of all wisdom. He made Solomon the wisest ruler in history. And that same wisdom can be ours if we ask for it. Let's remind our kids that we can go to God through reading our Bible and through prayer for insight and wisdom. We can trust him in all things because he has all the wisdom.
Thanks for joining us today for our second episode in our Shelter in Peace series. Make sure to follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or subscribe to us here on YouTube so that you can keep updated in this series and future series to come. Thanks. We'll see you next time.